for sentimental reasons. Last year I was just a beginner, and you gave me a chance, and at the end of it you said you'd ask me back, and that really gave me a boost to my confidence. So when I got the call to come back, I just had to come. He gave a good intro as to what my story is about. It's interesting because I had to write that for a multicultural class, and never giving a thought to world events. But after I wrote it and I gave it a couple times, they said, "Oh, immigrants, that's really a hot topic." And I said, "Oh, well, that's good." I think I'm just going to tell the story. That's what they said. I'm not a preacher. My hometown is Bethlehem, Pennsylvania. I haven't lived there in 50 years, but I plan to be buried there because that's where my roots are. In 1854, a steel mill was built on the south side of the Lehigh River. And that steel mill grew and it grew and it grew until it was 3 miles long, and it became the second largest steel mill in the United States. It was responsible for the Golden Gate Bridge, the Chrysler Building, the Holland and Lincoln tunnels, and most of the battleships and aircraft carriers that helped us win the war. At one time, it employed 30,000 people in Bethlehem, Pennsylvania. But this isn't a history lesson. This is a story. In the early 1900s, word reached Eastern Europe and Southern Europe that there was work to be had in Pennsylvania. And thousands of immigrants came to work there. Among them were my grandparents. My grandparents were from Slovenia, but people came from Russia, Romania, Poland, Czechoslovakia, Greece, Italy. They all came and they all had things in common. First of all, they were all young. Most of them were teenagers. And they weren't millennials, that's for sure. They went to their parents and they said, "Mother, Father, I want to go to America. There is nothing for me here. The farm is too small. Besides, you have all my brothers and sisters to help you. I will go and I will work at this Bethlehem Steel, and I will send home money. Please give me your blessing." The other thing they had in common was they were mostly all Catholic, which explains all the brothers and sisters with no birth control. And finally, Eastern Europe was in a state of political unrest. The last thing you wanted to become was a soldier. And so they all came to my hometown. But there was one thing they didn't have in common, and that was language. So when they came, they sought out people that spoke their language. The Germans found the Germans, and the Romanians found the Romanians, and the Slovenians found the Slovenians. My grandmother told me, "When I come to this country, I go live with my sister and her husband, and we live in a house with 2 other families. All the men and the big boys, they went to work in the steel. All the women and the older girls, they went to work in the steel mill. And because I was the youngest and the last one to come, I stayed home and watched the children." Now you would think that with living conditions like that, their first priority would be to get their own home. But it wasn't. Their first priority was to build a church. And not a church made out of wood or brick, but a big church made out of huge pieces of granite, the kind of church that has a steeple and a bell tower and stained glass windows. And the Slovenians weren't the only one who did this. The Germans built a church. The Polish people built a church. The Greek Orthodox built a church, the Romanians built a church, the Russian Orthodox built a church, the Italians built a church. And in that 3 miles, there were so many churches. I grew up saying Bethlehem is a town that has a church and a bar on every corner. And why a church? Because a church was a place where you could go, you could laugh, you could cry, you could pray in your own language. People understood you. If you were a young man who came over by yourself, you could go to church and go to one of those festivals or family dinners and probably get some home cooking or close to it. You might find somebody who recently came over from your hometown, and you'd get all the news. The other reason the church was important was that Bethlehem Steel had no health insurance. They had no OSHA. You could burn yourself, lose a finger, break a leg, and where would you go? Where would you go for help? You'd go to the place where you had community. You would go to church. They even went so far as to build schools because they wanted their children to be taught, and their children didn't understand the language. Well, even with all this, it was really a hard life. And my grandmother's sister, she didn't like it here. She said, I don't know, I don't like it here. It's too crowded. The houses are all joined together. You can hear people through the walls. There is no privacy. The backyard is so small. There's no room for the children to play. And you can't even sit on the front porch without wiping off the steel dust. And the sky is always gray. And I'd rather be poor on a farm in my homeland and see the sun. And so my grandmother's sister and her husband left. But before they left, they married my grandmother off to the first available bachelor. She's not smiling in her wedding photo. She said, I didn't hardly know him. But it worked out for them. They went on to have 3 children, and they did get their own home. And that's where my father comes in. He was the first generation. He was born in the USA. He didn't care so much about having strudel. He wanted hot dogs and baseball. His priorities after he married my mother was to get a nice house and to send his kids to college. Well, he was working for the Bethlehem Steel, and now unions had come in. There was health insurance, and he was able to buy a nice house out in the suburbs. It had a nice yard and a big kitchen where my mother could cook anything she wanted. There was room to invite family and friends over. I remember every Sunday at 12 o'clock, Jolly Joe Timmer came on the radio, and he would play his polka music, and it went like this. In heaven there is no beer, that's why we drink it here. And when we are gone from here, our friends will be drinking all the beer. Tra-la-la-la-la-la. Tra-la-la-la-la. But what about the church? The church was 5 miles away. You only had 1 car. How would the kids go to school? Well, there's an Irish church right around the corner. Everybody speaks English now. It doesn't matter. Mass is in Latin anyway. The priest gives a sermon in English. And we have space in our home to invite friends. We can cook. Oh, and the Steel has health insurance. My father had health insurance that was supposed to last till he died. After he retired, my father and my mother were covered. That went away when my mother was like 85. My father had 15 weeks vacation. And that allowed him to have even another job and another career. And that's the reason he had money to send his kids to college. But when he sent me to college, he got more than he bargained for. I came home in mini skirts. But that was okay. He was still proud. He had a daughter that graduated from college. My mother was even more proud because I had a boyfriend who graduated from college. And he was a local boy. He was a second generation American too. And what's more, he got a job at the Bethlehem Steel. And he would wear a white shirt and a tie and a suit jacket. He was an engineer. He wouldn't get his hands dirty. Now, since I was going to be a teacher and he was going to work at the Bethlehem Steel, for certain we were going to be rich. And I believed it. And they planned our wedding accordingly. They invited 400 people. But it wasn't really a second-generation wedding. I did not get to be bridezilla. About the only thing I had to say about the whole thing was the color of the bridesmaids' dresses. Because my wedding was really a celebration of immigrants who had achieved the American dream. There was, the biggest fight we had was my husband and I had a friend who had a keyboard. And I told my Mom, he can play polkas, he really can. And he can play waltzes and any kind of music you want. But she was afraid it would be all rock and roll. For my wedding, we had the Varietones. 5 men over 60, 2 of which played the accordion. We danced the polka and the chadash, and we had a bridal dance. We had whiskey, beer, and birch beer for the kids. Everybody had a really good time. It didn't really matter. Except maybe the 20 friends we brought from college who had no clue what was going on. And we went off on our honeymoon, but we didn't get rich. In the 60s, 70s, the Bethlehem Steel started to decline. And there were a lot of reasons for that. They blamed it on foreign steel, but a lot of other reasons. Maybe giving everybody 15 weeks vacation wasn't such a good idea. But it hit Bethlehem really hard. Division by division by division started to close. They tried other things, but nothing could save it. And I think by 2002, it had gone bankrupt. Many of my cousins, uncles, friends, neighbors lost their job. We were the lucky ones. We had educations. We could go other places and do other things. And we did, which is why I haven't lived there for 50 years. But where's my town today? My town came back. The city fathers take credit for the fact that Bethlehem, Pennsylvania is between New York and Philadelphia. And they kind of made it a venue for all kinds of festivals, music, you name it, it's there. And the immigrants are coming back. But this time, they're coming across the Pacific Ocean. And they're coming from south of the U.S. border, I hope legally, to work in the casinos. There's one, a hotel. There's a ice skating venue. There's venues for huge draws for music. Every weekend there's a festival of some sort. And there is I'm going to mess this up, Museum of Industrial History, the Smithsonian National Museum of Industrial History, which is all about the Bethlehem Steel and the silk mills. So it's back. It's viable, it's alive, and what about me? I have property in Bethlehem too, and someday I'll go back and be next to my parents and my grandparents, because that's where my roots are. Thank you. Is there time for, do you want another one, or is there time? I don't know where we're at.
Yeah, okay, sure.
This one's about the other side of the family, and I'm letting out our deep, dark secrets. In Czechoslovakia, and this is all hearsay, because when those teenagers came over, they weren't thinking about their grandchildren and what was going on and where they were going. And besides that, they probably didn't really have any pictures or scrapbooks or the things that we keep. They came with their shirts on their back and very little else. So now I ain't got nothing. I'm really a second-generation American, and I can only go back to my grandparents. And the first story I told you came from my grandmother, who lived to be 100. The men didn't last very long back then. But my mother's side was even worse as far as having information. But one day I was at a family picnic, and my oldest aunt was sitting in a chair, and I walked past her, and she pulled my arm, and she said, "Sit down, I want to tell you a story." And I sat down, and this is the story I heard. So you have to take it as it is. Plus, I admit to being a storyteller, and I filled in the blanks. In Czechoslovakia, and that's what it was back then, there were a lot of towns and villages that supported a brick-making factory. Now, brick-making is not the best kind of work, especially back then. It was hot, it was dirty. They didn't have forklifts, so it required a lot of muscle. It was hard. It was hard on the people, men who worked there. And my great-grandfather, well, he didn't want this for his son. He wanted something better, so he apprenticed my grandfather out to be a carpenter. And that's what he was. But it didn't matter, because none of the young men in that area had any future. None. Because there was always a war going on there. And they didn't even know who they were fighting for or what they were fighting for. And the army was so ill-equipped, you were lucky if you got a gun, let alone a uniform. You'd be half-starved. You'd probably die. Most of them did. Or if you came home, you'd be maimed. You'd be missing a leg or an arm or an eye, or else you wouldn't have it all together up here. So faced with that kind of a future, the young men did what young men do. Every night they came home from work, had dinner with their families, showered, and hit the bars. I guess they called them taverns. And they would just have a jolly old time until the next day when they did the same thing. As for the girls, it was even worse. I mean, they dreamed of love and romance, but if they took advantage of it, their future either held them be a widow, or a wife with a handicapped husband, or a widow with kids. It wasn't much. Or you could be an old maid. And I think even though girls didn't have it as much freedom as boys, a few of them also went to the taverns. So one night, John, that's my grandfather's name, he was in the tavern with his buddies, and they were sitting around the table. And his buddies are whispering, and they're talking amongst each other. And John's like, "What's up? What's going on? What's the news?" "Well, it sounds like there's an American in town, and he's part of a business that has a cement factory in Cementon, Pennsylvania, which is right near Bethlehem. He's looking for experienced brick makers. And he's willing to pay their way to the United States. But we have to sneak out, because if they find out we're leaving, the army, whatever, wouldn't be too happy. So tomorrow, this is the plan. We're all going to get up. We're going to go to work. We're going to come home. We're going to have our last dinner with our families. And then we're going to come to the bar. And when we're here, one by one, we'll space ourselves and we'll leave. And we'll go meet him down by the docks. And so there's John. He's not an experienced brickmaker. He's a carpenter. His father, who tried to help him out, actually turned out to be a bad thing, because now he couldn't go. So John did what every young man does when things go bad. He had himself a tied one on that night. The next day, he went to the bar because he wanted to be there when his friends left. And they came in, and as the plan went, one by one they left. And John was there thinking, I'm going to tie another one on tonight. But after a while, after they had left, he looked up and he saw somebody at the window, and it was one of his friends, and he was saying, "Come on, come on, come on." And John went outside to investigate what was going on, and his friend said, we talked to the man from America, and he said he needs help. He needs to build dormitories for us to live in over there while we're making cement. So he needs carpenters. You can come, John, you can come. And John left with them that night without going home and seeing his family one last time. In another town nearby, there was a lucky young girl. Her aunt and her husband were going to America to work in the cement plant. And because they agreed to chaperone her, she was going with them. Her name was Sophie. And when they got to the cement factory, Sophie and her aunt got a job as maids because they only had like one dormitory. And the way it worked was the day shift slept in the beds at night, and the night shift slept in those same beds during the day. So there was a lot of washing and sheets, and that's what my grandmother did. Well, Sophie and John met, fell in love rather quickly, and Sophie's aunt, she saw what was going on, and she was going to get those two married right fast before there was any, it was her job because she was the chaperone. So they arranged the wedding, and this is where the story gets. On the night before the wedding, Sophie's aunt got a letter from home. It said that there was a girl in the town that was about to have John's baby. Sophie's aunt didn't know what to do. Should she tell Sophie? First of all, Sophie couldn't marry John. This was terrible. Or should she tell Sophie? What would Sophie say? Oh my gosh, we started cooking and everything for the wedding tomorrow. What should I do? Maybe I should talk to John. So she went to John and she told John, and John said, well, it could be true. You know, that last night the night before the last night when I had tying one on because I knew all my buddies were going, and one of our friends, this woman, she comforted me in the only way women can give men comfort sometimes, and it could be my child. And Sophie's aunt said, what are you going to do? What are you going to do? I wish I was back home. If I was back home, there would be no marriage. This would not happen. John said, "Oh, please, Auntie, please don't tell Sophie. Please, look what it took for us to get here. We finally have a chance. We have a chance at a life. I love Sophie. I want to marry her. I can't go home. I don't even have the money to go home. If I go back home, I'll be thrown in jail anyway. Please don't tell Sophie." And they didn't tell Sophie. And John and Sophie were married the next day. And they must have had a happy marriage because they had 11 children. The oldest one was Margaret, the one who told me this story. My cousins, well, anyway, what I do know that's true about this story is that when Margaret was in her 60s, she went to Europe to visit family, and she met her half-sister. And so, love conquers all. Thank you.